where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
Here's something they don't tell you about prisons. The most dangerous ones don't have bars you can see. They're built with whispers that sound like concern, with control disguised as love, with invisible chains that tighten so slowly you don't even notice you're suffocating until you can barely breathe. And here's the part that'll make you uncomfortable. You might be living in one right now and calling it normal. Think I'm being dramatic? Stay with me, because what I'm about to share isn't some fairy tale from centuries ago. It's a pattern that repeats itself in families, in relationships, in situations where someone with power decides that your voice, your choices, your very existence needs to be managed and controlled. This young duchess? She was living the nightmare that so many people experience but can't name. Trapped in her own home, erased by someone who smiled while destroying her. And everybody around her, her father, the servants, society itself, saw nothing wrong. They called it family. They called it guidance. They called it what's best for her. But here's the truth they didn't want anyone to see. It was systematic destruction of a human soul, one careful manipulation at a time. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is just some historical drama, some made-up story about nobility and balls and dukes. And you're right. This particular tale is fiction, a story crafted from the shadows of what could have been, inspired by the very real darkness that existed in those grand manors and still exists today in different forms. But the mechanics of control, the gaslighting, the isolation, the financial manipulation, the way someone can make you disappear without anyone noticing? That's not fiction at all. That's happening right now in modern homes, in relationships, in families where everything looks perfect from the outside while someone's dying on the inside. The Duchess's blue dress and the Duke's ballroom might be inventions, but the invisible prison? That's real. And if you've ever felt like you're screaming and nobody hears you, like you're fading and nobody notices, like someone's rewriting your reality and everyone believes their version instead of yours, then you already know this story isn't really about duchesses and dukes at all. It's about the human experience of being controlled, erased, and fighting like hell to become visible again. So here's what we're going to unpack in this story. How does someone turn you into a ghost in your own life without anyone noticing? What are the specific techniques, the codes, the conspiracies of silence, the hidden patterns that make psychological imprisonment so effective? And most importantly, how do you break free when the cage doesn't have doors you can see? When the chains are made of guilt and fear, and the belief that maybe you deserve this somehow? Because the Duchess's journey from invisible victim to woman who defied her captor at that forbidden ball? That's not just entertainment. It's a roadmap, a revelation of how control works and how courage responds. And by the time we're done, you're going to recognize these patterns everywhere, in history, in fiction, and maybe in situations a lot closer to home than you'd like to admit. This isn't a story about rescue. It's about recognition, resistance, and the terrifying, beautiful moment when you decide that disappearing slowly is worse than the risk of fighting back. So, are you ready to see how deep this enigma goes? Because once you understand how invisible prisons work, you can never unsee them again. You know what's funny about prisons? We picture them with iron bars, heavy locks, guards pacing back and forth. But here's the thing nobody tells you. The most effective prisons don't have walls you can touch. They're built with whispers, with concerns that sound like love, with questions that plant seeds of doubt so deep you forget what certainty even feels like. The first time our young Duchess tried stepping out on her own, just 3 months after her father married Cellini, the stepmother didn't slam a door in her face. That would have been too obvious, too crude. Instead, Cellini leaned in close, her voice dripping with what seemed like genuine worry, and asked, "Don't you think your father's heart couldn't handle the stress of a scandal right now? His health is so fragile." And here's the kicker. Her father was in the next room, laughing at some joke with the butler, healthy as a damn horse. But that seed, already planted in the girl's mind, already growing its roots into her brain, making her question everything she thought she knew. See, Celine's gaslighting through imaginary illness was like telling someone the floor's on fire when it's perfectly cold. At first, the young Duchess would look down, confused. Then she started stepping lighter, just in case. Before she knew it, she'd stopped walking altogether through the manor's halls. Eventually, she was afraid to even breathe too loud around her father, because what if that stress triggered the mysterious condition Celine kept mentioning? That's exactly how it works. It's not about the truth. It's about making you question your own perception until you can't trust your eyes anymore. The Duchess would see her father lifting heavy books, riding horses across the estate, eating like a king at dinner, but Celine's words echoed louder than reality. His fragile heart, his delicate condition. The stress might kill him. And just like that, every choice the girl wanted to make became a potential murder weapon. She thought she was protecting her beloved father, but really, she was building her own cage, brick by invisible brick, and handing over the key to Celine, who never intended to set her free. The isolation? Oh, that's where Celine's real artistry came in. It didn't happen overnight. That would have been too suspicious. It was gradual, methodical, almost beautiful in its cruelty. First ball the Duchess missed. Celine claimed the girl had a horrible headache, couldn't possibly attend. Second one? Her gown wasn't ready in time. Such unfortunate timing with the seamstress. Third? Do you really want to be seen in public after that rumor, darling? What rumor, you ask? That the Duchess had smiled at Thomas, the young gardener. Literally, that. A smile. A human gesture of acknowledgement transformed into evidence of supposed impropriety, lack of judgment, need for constant supervision. Each excuse sounded reasonable on its own, but string them together, and you've got a pattern of disappearance orchestrated by Celine. People in society stopped expecting to see the Duchess. Then they stopped inviting her. Then they stopped remembering she existed at all. She became a ghost in her own life. And the scariest part? The girl didn't even realize she was fading until she was nearly transparent. A shadow moving through the estate, while Celine solidified her position as the true lady of the house. Now, let's talk about money, because that's where Celine's mask of care really showed its cracks. The Duchess's mother had left her jewelry. Of course she did. Beautiful pieces, family heirlooms, things that connected the girl to her late mother's memory and gave her independence. So where were they now? Oh, they're safely stored away for when you marry someone appropriate, Cellini would say with that practiced smile, her fingers adorned with rings that suspiciously resembled pieces from that very collection. Translation? When I approve. Which means never. Selina's financial control dressed up as protection was one of the oldest tricks in the aristocratic book, and it worked like a charm because it sounded so reasonable to the Duke. We're just keeping your daughter's inheritance safe, darling. We're just making sure she doesn't make foolish decisions. But strip away the language, and what you've got is simple. Dependency. The Duchess couldn't leave if she couldn't afford to. Couldn't choose if she didn't have resources. Couldn't fight back when every penny she'd need to survive was locked behind Celine's approval, hidden away in some secret vault only the stepmother could access. Here's an analogy that'll make this whole thing crystal clear. You know how you cook a frog? No, I'm not losing it. Stay with me. If you throw a frog into boiling water, it jumps right out. Survival instinct kicks in immediately. But if you put that same frog in lukewarm water and gradually increase the temperature, degree by degree, it doesn't notice, doesn't panic, doesn't leap to safety. It just sits there as the heat rises until it's cooked alive without ever attempting escape. That's exactly what Celine did to the young Duchess. She didn't throw the girl into a prison cell. That would have triggered a fight response, maybe even caught the Duke's attention. Instead, Celine turned up the temperature so slowly, so carefully, that by the time the Duchess realized she was being boiled alive, she was already half dead inside. Every small restriction seemed reasonable to her father. Every tiny loss of freedom felt justified to the household staff. Until one day, the girl woke up and realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd made a decision for herself. Couldn't recall when she'd last spoken without Celine's shadow looming over every word. The codes of control were everywhere once you learned to recognize them, woven into every interaction between Celine and her stepdaughter. They were in the concerned questions that weren't really questions, in the helpful suggestions that weren't really suggestions, in the protective measures that weren't really protection. I'm just worried about you, sweetheart. I'm just trying to help you navigate society. I'm just thinking of your well-being and your father's happiness. These phrases became Celine's weapons, sharp as any blade, cutting away at the Duchess's autonomy while sounding like maternal love to anyone listening. And the conspiracy of it all, because it was a conspiracy, even if it was just Celine orchestrating it with frightening precision, relied on everyone else not seeing the pattern. The Duke didn't notice, because Celine told him his daughter was delicate, moody, going through a difficult phase of grief. Society didn't. Notice because the girl was still showing up to some events, still smiling when required, still looking like the perfect nobleman's daughter. She was hidden in plain sight, screaming silently, while everyone assumed she was fine. That's the enigma of Celine's invisible prison. It was designed to be unseen by everyone except the person trapped inside it. What got lost in this kind of confinement wasn't just the Duchess's freedom. It was her sense of self. The vestiges of who she'd been before her mother's death and Celine's arrival started disappearing like morning fog under harsh sun. She stopped having opinions because every opinion was criticized by her stepmother. She stopped having preferences because her preferences never mattered anyway in Celine's carefully controlled household. Eventually, the girl couldn't even remember what she wanted, separate from what Celine permitted her to want. It was like losing pieces of herself so gradually that she didn't notice the absence until she looked in her bedroom mirror and realized there was nothing looking back. Just an empty shell going through motions, saying the right things at dinner, wearing the right expressions during the Duke's gatherings, completely and utterly lost to herself. And the scariest revelation? Part of the Duchess started to believe she deserved it. That maybe Celine was right. Maybe she was too naive, too impulsive, too much like her flighty mother, too everything her stepmother said she was. That's when the prison became permanent. When the girl started guarding her own cell, doing Celine's work for her. But here's what nobody tells you about breaking points. They don't always come from strength. Sometimes they come from sheer exhaustion with being half alive. Sometimes the conflict inside you between survival and actual living reaches a point where something's gotta give. The Duchess couldn't stay in Selena's lukewarm water forever, even if jumping out meant landing somewhere unknown and potentially worse. There was gonna come a moment when the hidden truth she'd been hiding from herself would become impossible to ignore. This isn't living. This is slow disappearance. And if she was gonna vanish anyway, might as well do it on her own terms, fighting for something real instead of fading into nothing while pretending everything's fine. That moment was coming for her, building like pressure in a sealed container, waiting for just one more turn of Selene's screw to make everything explode. Mary, her loyal lady's maid, could see it in the Duchess's eyes during those quiet morning routines. Something was about to break. The question wasn't if, but when, and what would be left standing after the storm finally hit. There was a day, the Duchess remembered it exactly, down to the hour, when she looked in her bedroom mirror and didn't recognize herself. Not because she looked physically different. Her features were the same, her hair still fell the same way, her dress fit just as it always had. But there was nobody behind those eyes staring back at her. You know when you look at an old photograph and think, wow, I looked so alive back then? She was looking at the living version of that realization, and it hit harder than any of Selene's carefully crafted insults ever could. Body present, standing right there in front of the gilded mirror her mother had once used. Person? Completely absent. It was like watching a ghost pretend to be human, going through all the right motions, but forgetting what it felt like to actually exist. That's when she understood the true price of invisibility. It wasn't that others couldn't see you. It was that eventually you couldn't see yourself either. The reflection became a stranger, and the stranger became all that was left of who you used to be before Selene's systematic erasure began. The first thing that disappeared? Her voice. And I don't mean she stopped talking. She still spoke when spoken to, still answered the Duke's questions at dinner, still made polite conversation when required. But she stopped having opinions that were truly hers. At first, Selene would challenge everything the Duchess said. That's a rather naive perspective, don't you think? Your mother may have believed that, but we know better now. I'm not sure someone your age understands the complexities involved. Each correction felt minor, almost helpful even. But pile enough of those corrections onto a young woman's shoulders, and eventually she stops offering her thoughts altogether. Then came the preferences. She stopped knowing if she actually liked tea or just drank it because Selene served it. Stopped knowing if she preferred blue gowns or if that was just what her stepmother ordered the seamstress to make. The Duchess would sit in the drawing room, and someone would ask her opinion on something simple, like which flowers looked lovelier for the hall. And she'd freeze. Not because she didn't care, but because she genuinely couldn't remember what she wanted, separate from what was permitted, expected, approved. That's the secret cost nobody warns you about. You don't just lose your voice. You lose the memory of ever having one. Then there were the connections, the relationships that withered under Selene's careful cultivation of isolation. The Duchess had a childhood friend named Clara. They'd grown up together, shared secrets, promised they'd be in each other's weddings someday. Clara tried to visit 6 different times after the Duke's remarriage. 6 times. First visit? Selene informed her the Duchess was sleeping, exhausted from a long night. Second? The girl was feeling ill. Better not risk contagion. Third? They'd just left for an unexpected trip to the countryside. Fourth? The Duchess was occupied with lessons. Fifth? It wasn't a good time. Perhaps schedule in advance next time. Sixth? Selene didn't even bother with an excuse, just had the butler turn Clara away at the door with a vague promise to pass along the message. Clara stopped trying after that. And honestly, the Duchess didn't blame her friend one bit. How many times do you knock on a door that never opens before you accept that maybe nobody wants you there? The tragedy wasn't that Clara gave up. It was that by the time the Duchess realized what Celine had done, the friendship was already a ghost of what it had been. You can't resurrect connections after they've been dead that long. The vestiges of those relationships just disappeared, like they'd never mattered at all. But perhaps the cruelest loss was the loss of future, of possibility, of hope for anything beyond Celine's control. See, every young woman in the Duchess's social class knew the unspoken rules. You had 2, maybe 3 seasons to make a good match. To be seen at the right balls, courted by the right gentleman, positioned for the right marriage that would secure your place in society. After that, you became a curiosity, a spinster, a problem nobody quite knew how to solve, and the Duchess was watching her window slam shut, one missed ball at a time. She'd been 17 when her father married Celine, prime age for entering society properly. Now she was 19, nearly 20, and she'd been to exactly 4 public events in 2 years. 4. While girls younger than her were already engaged, already planning their futures, already escaping their fathers' homes for households of their own. Celine knew exactly what she was doing, letting that clock tick down. Each lost opportunity was another nail in the coffin of the Duchess's independence, another guarantee that the girl would remain trapped, unmarriageable, dependent. It was a long game, played with frightening patience, and Celine was winning without the Duchess even realizing they were playing. Here's the thing about loneliness that most people get wrong. It's not about being alone. The Duchess was rarely alone, actually. The manor was full of people. Her father, Celine, the servants, visiting nobles, dinner guests. She was constantly surrounded by human beings. But loneliness? That's being in a room full of people and still feeling completely isolated. It's like being trapped in an aquarium. You can see the world outside. The world can see you swimming around in there. But there's this impenetrable glass between you and everything real. You press your hands against it, trying to reach through. You scream, but the sound doesn't carry beyond the water. You wave frantically, but everyone just smiles at the pretty fish and moves on to the next exhibit. The Duchess would sit at dinner with her father and Celine, surrounded by servants and guests, participating in conversations about politics and weather and society gossip, and feel like she was watching it all happen from somewhere very far away. Connection didn't penetrate the glass. Understanding didn't reach her. She was there, and simultaneously not there at all, existing in some liminal space between presence and complete disappearance. That's the enigma of invisible suffering. You're drowning in a room full of people who think you're fine. And if you've ever felt like your family doesn't really see you, like they look at you but don't perceive who you actually are, then you know exactly what the Duchess was going through. If you've ever been misunderstood by the very person who was supposed to protect you, defend you, know you better than anyone else in the world. If you've ever tried to ask for help and been called dramatic, oversensitive, ungrateful for everything you've been given. If you've ever screamed silently while everyone around you praised how well-adjusted you seemed, then you understand this particular flavor of hell. The Duke loved his daughter. Nobody questioned that. But he loved the version of her that Celine presented to him. Quiet, obedient, content with her domestic life, needing a firm maternal hand to guide her through grief and adolescence. He didn't see the girl slowly suffocating under that narrative, didn't see how Celine's guidance was actually erasure. didn't see that his daughter was losing herself piece by piece, while he smiled and complimented his new wife on her dedication to his child's well-being. That blindness, that willful or ignorant inability to see the truth, might have hurt worse than Celine's active cruelty. Because it meant the Duchess was alone, even when standing right next to the person who should have been her greatest ally. The conflict inside her became unbearable. Part of her, the part Celine had carefully cultivated, believed this was normal. That all young women felt this way, that she was being childish, resistant to proper discipline, ungrateful for a stepmother who cared so much about her development. That voice sounded suspiciously like Celine's, whispering that she should be thankful for the structure, the guidance, the protection from her own poor judgment. But there was another part, buried deep, and, getting quieter every day, that knew something was profoundly wrong. That remembered what it felt like to laugh without permission, to have dreams that were hers alone, to exist as a full person rather than a carefully managed project. These two versions of herself were at war, and she was losing on both fronts. The Celine-approved version meant safety, but death of self. The authentic version meant potential destruction, but at least it would be real. She couldn't reconcile them, couldn't find middle ground, couldn't figure out how to survive Celine's regime while also remaining herself. So she did what trapped animals do. She went still, stopped fighting, stopped hoping, just existed in the terrible silence of invisible imprisonment. But here's what nobody tells you about hitting rock bottom. Sometimes that's where you find bedrock. Sometimes when you've lost everything, including yourself, there's a strange freedom in having nothing left to lose. The Duchess didn't know it yet, but she was approaching that point. The point where disappearing completely started to seem less frightening than continuing to fade slowly. Where the prospect of Celine's worst punishments became less terrifying than another year of this half-life. Mary, her lady's maid, noticed it first. The way the Duchess's eyes had gone from sad to empty, from fearful to resigned. Mary had seen that look before, in other young women trapped in impossible situations. It was the look that came right before someone did something desperate. Right before they either gave up entirely or decided to fight back with everything they had left. The question hanging in the air, unspoken but heavy as storm clouds, was simple. Which way would the Duchess go? Would she surrender to the silence completely? Let Celine's version of her become the only version that existed? Or would some spark, some hidden reserve of her mother's strength, ignite into something Celine couldn't control? The answer was coming, carried on the forbidden invitation to the Worthington Ball that would soon land in Mary's careful hands. Mary brought the invitation on a silver tray, her hands trembling just slightly as she entered the Duchess's bedroom. The Worthington Ball, one of the season's most prestigious events, the kind of gathering where futures were decided and matches were made. The envelope was cream-colored, sealed with the Worthington family crest in deep burgundy wax, and it represented everything the Duchess had been denied for 2 long years. Mary didn't need to say anything. The look in her eyes said it all. This is your chance. But before the Duchess could even open it, before she could let herself hope for even a moment, Celine's voice drifted up from the hallway. Her stepmother had already decided. The Duchess wouldn't be attending. Didn't ask, didn't discuss, didn't even pretend to consider it. Just informed her stepdaughter with that practiced tone of maternal authority that staying home would be more appropriate given recent circumstances. What circumstances? There were none. Just Celine's continued campaign to keep the girl hidden, unmarriageable, controllable. and something inside the Duchess, something that had been stretched tighter and tighter for months, just snapped. Not like breaking down in tears, not like exploding in anger. It snapped like a rope that had been pulled beyond its limits, and suddenly there was this strange, almost violent sense of freedom on the other side of that breaking point. See, there's this moment that comes when you've been obedient for so long that obedience itself becomes unbearable. The Duchess sat on her bed, that unopened invitation in her hands, and she had this crystal-clear realization. If she obeyed Celine today, she'd obey tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Every single day until she ceased to exist as anything more than a doll Celine dressed up and positioned however she wanted. Until the girl her mother had raised, the one who was supposed to be bold and curious and full of life, was completely erased, replaced by this hollow thing that went through motions without feeling them. That's when obedience stops being about keeping peace and starts being about choosing your own extinction. The Duchess looked at that invitation, then looked at her reflection in the mirror, then looked at Mary's hopeful face, and something crystallized inside her. A decision. Not a careful, well-planned decision. Not a safe decision. Just a decision that felt like choosing to exist rather than continuing to disappear. She was going to that ball. Celine's permission wasn't required anymore because the Duchess had finally stopped asking for it. That recognition alone felt like breathing after being underwater for 2 years. Painful, shocking, but absolutely necessary for survival. But recognizing you need to do something and actually doing it are two very different things, aren't they? The Duchess wasn't stupid. She understood the risks she was taking. Worst-case scenario? Celine would be furious. And Celine's fury wasn't something to take lightly. The woman could make life even more unbearable than it already was. Could poison the Duke against his daughter completely. Could potentially even have the Duchess sent away to some distant relative's home, exiled from the only life she'd ever known. The girl sat there calculating these possibilities, weighing them against the alternative of staying silent and obedient. And you know what she thought? At least if she sends me away, I'll be out. That's when you know you're living in hell. When exile sounds like freedom. When punishment sounds like rescue. When the worst thing someone can threaten you with is actually better than your current reality. The Duchess laughed at that realization, and Mary looked startled because it had been so long since she'd heard her young mistress laugh at all. But it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone who'd finally seen the whole game board and realized she'd been playing by rules that only applied to her, while everyone else moved their pieces freely. The preparation had to be done in complete secrecy, like planning an escape from prison, which, in a way, it was. Mary became her co-conspirator, her ally in this quiet rebellion. The Duchess had a gown, you see, a beautiful dress in blue silk, the color of summer sky right before sunset, with delicate embroidery that her mother had personally commissioned before she died. It was supposed to be the Duchess's debut ball gown, meant for her introduction to society as a young woman ready for courtship. But Celine had never seen it. The dress had arrived after the Duke's remarriage, and Mary, clever, loyal Mary, had hidden it away in a trunk in the servants' quarters for safekeeping. 2 years that gown had been waiting, wrapped in tissue paper, preserved like a secret hope that someday it might be needed. Now it would be. Mary brought it up piece by piece over several days, so nobody would notice. First the underskirts, then the bodice, then the sleeves, finally, the overskirt with all its beautiful details. They hid everything in the back of the Duchess's wardrobe, Behind dresses Selene had approved, boring, matronly things in colors that washed the girl out, and styles that made her look younger and more childish than her age. This blue dress, though, it would make her look like what she was, a young woman of marriageable age, eligible and appropriate for courtship. Exactly what Selene had been trying to prevent anyone from seeing. Here's the thing about courage that nobody really explains properly. It's not the absence of fear. It's not feeling brave and confident and ready to face whatever comes. Courage is doing something despite the absolute terror that's paralyzing your entire body. It's like standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at darkness, having no idea if there's water below or just rocks that'll kill you on impact. You might die if you jump. The fall might destroy you. But here's the other half of that equation. Staying on top of that cliff is also death. Just slower, more certain, less dramatic, but equally final. So you're choosing between two types of death, really. The quick potential one that comes from jumping into the unknown, or the guaranteed slow one that comes from staying exactly where you are. The Duchess understood this completely as she made her plans with Mary. Going to that ball might result in Selene's worst retribution, might end whatever fragile relationship remained between her and her father, might mark her as disobedient and ruin what little reputation she had left. But not going? That was guaranteed destruction. That was choosing to let Selena win completely. That was accepting that she'd never be anything more than a ghost in her own life. When you frame it that way, the choice becomes almost simple. Terrifying. Yes, but simple. The night before the ball, the Duchess tried on that blue dress for the first time in 2 years. Mary laced up the back with practiced fingers, and when the Duchess finally looked in the mirror, she saw something that made her breath catch. She saw her mother. Not in a literal physical sense. They didn't look that much alike. But there was something in the way the dress fit, the way it made her stand straighter, the way it reminded her of who she was supposed to become. Her mother had been the kind of woman who laughed out loud without covering her mouth, who took up space in a room without apologizing for it, who was kind but never let that kindness be mistaken for weakness. The Duchess had been so young when her mother died that some of the memories had gone hazy, but standing there in that blue dress, she remembered the essence of the woman who'd raised her, the woman who would have been horrified to see what Selene had done to her daughter. And the Duchess made a promise to that reflection, to that memory, to herself. Tonight, even if it's just for one evening, I'm going to be her daughter. Not Selene's victim. Not my father's disappointing child. Not society's forgotten girl. Just hers. It was the first promise she'd made to herself in 2 years that felt like it mattered. Like it meant something beyond just surviving another day in Selene's carefully constructed prison of propriety and control. Mary helped her plan every detail, because they both knew. If this was going to work, if the Duchess was actually going to make it to that ball, they couldn't leave anything to chance. Selene and the Duke would leave for the Worthington estate at 8 o'clock. The Duchess would wait exactly 30 minutes to ensure they were truly gone and not returning for some forgotten item. Then she'd dress quickly, take the servant's carriage that Mary had arranged with the help of Thomas, the sympathetic gardener who'd always been kind to the young Duchess. They'd arrive fashionably late, late enough that Selene and the Duke would already be settled in, surrounded by other guests, unable to cause a scene without drawing exactly the kind of attention Selena desperately avoided. It was a good plan. Not perfect, but good enough. The only real question mark was what happened after. What would Selene do when she saw her stepdaughter walk into that ballroom wearing a dress that announced her eligibility, her beauty, her presence? What would the Duke do when forced to acknowledge that his daughter had directly defied his wife's orders? The Duchess didn't have answers to those questions, didn't know what morning would bring or what consequences she'd face. But she'd stopped caring about the aftermath. All that mattered was this one night, this one chance, this one moment of choosing to be seen instead of invisible. Everything else? She'd deal with it when it came. For now, the secret plan was set. The forbidden invitation was accepted in her heart, if not officially replied to, and the blue dress hung ready in her wardrobe like a flag of rebellion waiting to be raised. The morning of the ball arrived with deceptive normalcy. Breakfast was the usual affair. The Duke reading his correspondence, Cellini making small talk about the evening's event they'd be attending, the Duchess silent and seemingly compliant. Celine even mentioned, almost as an afterthought, "You'll have a quiet evening to yourself, dear. Perhaps work on your embroidery. Mary can bring dinner to your room." Each word was another bar. On the cage, another assumption of the Duchess's continued obedience and disappearance. And the Duchess just nodded, smiled slightly, said, "Yes, stepmother," in that quiet, defeated voice Cellini had come to expect. It was a performance, her last performance of the obedient ghost. Inside, though? Inside, she was counting down hours. Inside, she was remembering the weight of that blue dress, the promise she'd made to her mother's memory, the feeling of that rope snapping and setting her free. The conflict between appearing calm and feeling completely electrified with nervous energy was almost unbearable. But she managed it, played her part perfectly. Because she'd learned from a master manipulator, hadn't she? Celine had taught her well how to hide truth behind appropriate expressions, how to conceal real intentions behind acceptable words, how to be one thing while appearing to be another. The Duchess was just using those lessons for her own purposes now. And as Celine and her father's carriage pulled away from the manor that evening, disappearing down the tree-lined drive toward the Worthington estate, the young woman stood at her window and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 long years. Anticipation for what came next instead of dread. Descending that grand staircase into the Worthington ballroom was more terrifying than any battlefield the Duchess could imagine. Her hands gripped the banister so tightly her knuckles went white, and she had to consciously remind herself to breathe. In, out, like it was something she'd forgotten how to do naturally. Because she knew, with absolute certainty, that Celine was down there somewhere in that glittering crowd. And when her stepmother saw her, when Cellini realized that her carefully controlled stepdaughter had defied her, had escaped the invisible prison, had dared to show up wearing that dress, well, the Duchess didn't know exactly what would happen, but it wouldn't be pleasant. Yet here's what actually occurred, something she never could have predicted. The musicians stopped playing. Just stopped. Mid-waltz, the violins went silent, the piano player's hands froze above the keys, and suddenly the only sound in that massive ballroom was the rustle of her blue silk dress and her heart hammering so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. And it wasn't because she was special, let's be clear about that. It was because nobody expected to see her. 2 years invisible. 2 years erased from society's memory. And suddenly, present. Corporeal. Undeniably there, descending those stairs like a ghost who decided to become human again. The faces she saw looking up at her told 1,000 different stories. There was surprise, obviously. Eyebrows raised, mouths slightly open, that universal expression of, "Wait, is that who I think it is?" There was curiosity in the younger set, the ones who'd only heard rumors about the Duke's reclusive daughter. and were now seeing her for the first time. Some smiles, too, genuine ones, from people who'd known her mother, Lady Pemberton, Lord Ashford's aunt, the Countess of something or other, whose name the Duchess couldn't quite remember through her panic. These were people who remembered her as a child, who'd wondered what happened to that bright little girl, and seemed almost relieved to see evidence she still existed. But then there was one face that wasn't surprised or curious or pleased. One face that had gone completely, utterly cold. Celine stood near the refreshment table, a glass of champagne frozen halfway to her lips. And if looks could actually kill, if human eyes could shoot daggers the way they do in stories, the Duchess would have turned to ash right there on that staircase. It was hatred distilled to its purest form, barely concealed behind a mask of shocked propriety. And in that moment, the Duchess knew. There would be consequences. Severe ones. But she also knew something else. She didn't care. Not anymore. Celine crossed that ballroom floor in seconds, moving with the kind of speed that suggested barely controlled fury. Nobody else would have noticed. To them, she probably just looked like a concerned stepmother greeting her wayward charge. But the Duchess saw the tension in Celene's jaw, the way her fingers clenched around that champagne glass, the controlled violence in every step. When Selene reached her, she leaned in close, so close that anyone watching would think she was offering a motherly welcome, maybe adjusting the girl's dress or whispering some sweet encouragement. Instead, her voice came out like ice scraping against stone. "You're going to regret this. I promise you. You will regret this defiance." The words were meant to terrify, meant to send the Duchess running back to her room like a scolded child. They would have worked, too, probably, just a few days ago. But something had fundamentally shifted inside the young woman standing there in her mother's blue dress. She met Celine's eyes, really met them, maybe for the first time ever, and her voice didn't shake when she responded. "I already regret many things. 2 years of silence, 2 years of disappearing, 2 years of letting you decide who I am. This?" She gestured slightly at the ballroom, at her presence there, at her act of rebellion. "This won't be one of them." And it was true. Whatever punishment came later, whatever price she'd pay for this moment of freedom, it would be worth it. Because she was choosing it. That made all the difference. After Selene stalked away, unable to cause a scene without revealing the ugly truth of their relationship to society, the Duchess found herself standing alone in the middle of that glittering ballroom. And it hit her then, really hit her. She was on an island, surrounded by water on all sides. She'd burned the bridge back to safety, back to her room, back to invisible compliance. There was no returning from this act of defiance. Selene would make sure of that. Her father would eventually have to choose between his wife and his daughter, and the Duchess wasn't naive enough to think she'd win that conflict. She'd made her grand gesture, defied the tyrant, shown up in the forbidden blue dress. And now what? The musicians had started playing again. Couples whirled across the floor. Conversations buzzed around her like bees. And she stood there, utterly alone, despite being surrounded by hundreds of people, wondering if she'd just made a catastrophic mistake. Freedom, she was learning, wasn't the same as safety. Courage didn't guarantee success. Sometimes you jumped off the cliff, and there was just rocks below. Maybe this was one of those times. Maybe she'd destroyed her life for nothing more than one night of pretending to be whole again. But then, and this is where the story shifts, where everything changes, he appeared. not with trumpets or formal announcement or any kind of dramatic flourish. The Duke of Ashford simply walked into the ballroom through the terrace doors, probably coming in from the gardens where he'd been smoking cigars with other gentlemen, and the entire room changed, not just for the Duchess, though she certainly felt it. The room changed for everyone. See, when someone like the Duke of Ashford enters a space, gravity itself seems to shift. He was one of the most eligible bachelors in England, wealthy beyond measure, titled handsome in that aristocratic way that came from generations of good breeding, and crucially, unmarried by choice, not by lack of options. Every matchmaking mama in that ballroom tensed. Every unmarried girl suddenly stood a little straighter. Every man subtly adjusted their posture. That instinctive response to the presence of someone higher in the social hierarchy. And he was looking across that crowded ballroom with those sharp, assessing eyes that missed nothing, looking at the clusters of debutantes, looking at the political alliances forming in corners, looking at the spectacle and performance of it all. And then his eyes landed on her, on the Duchess, standing alone in her mother's blue dress, still radiating defiance and terror in equal measure. And he didn't look away. That moment, that single moment when the Duke of Ashford's attention focused on her, felt like the universe had conspired to create one perfect second. Not destiny in the romantic fairy tale sense, though there was certainly something electric in his gaze. But timing. Perfect, impossible timing. She'd chosen this exact night to reappear. He'd chosen this exact moment to walk into the ballroom. Cellini had just walked away, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. The musicians were playing a waltz. The crowd was distracted by their own dramas. Every single element had aligned like some cosmic combination lock, finally clicking into place, opening a door the Duchess hadn't even known existed. It was the kind of moment that makes you believe, just for a second, that maybe everything you suffered through, all the pain, all the silence, all the disappearance, was leading you to this exact instant. That maybe there was some hidden code to life, some secret pattern, and you'd finally stumbled onto the right path after wandering lost for so long. She didn't know who he was yet, didn't know his title or his reputation, or why everyone seemed to collectively hold their breath when he moved. All she knew was that someone was seeing her, really seeing her, not looking through her like she was glass, not looking at her like she was a problem to be solved, looking at her like she was a person worth noticing, worth approaching, worth knowing. He crossed the ballroom floor toward her, and the crowd parted. Literally parted, like he was Moses and they were the Red Sea, creating a path without even being asked. The Duchess's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. Fear mixed with hope, mixed with confusion, mixed with something she couldn't quite name. This was the Duke of Ashford. She knew that now, had recognized him from portraits and distant sightings at other events years ago. Men like him didn't approach girls like her. Men like him had their pick of anyone, and they certainly didn't waste time on reclusive daughters of minor nobility who'd been hidden away for 2 years. And yet, he was walking straight toward her, his eyes never leaving hers, like she was the only person in that entire ballroom who mattered. When he reached her, he didn't ask if she was accompanied. He could see she was, had probably noticed Celine's heated conversation with her just moments before. He didn't ask her father's permission, though that would have been proper protocol. Asking would have meant giving Celine opportunity to interfere, to refuse, to create a scene. Instead, the Duke of Ashford simply extended his hand and waited. No words, just an offered hand and a raised eyebrow that asked a silent question. Will you? It was her choice. The first real choice anyone had offered her in 2 years. Not a command disguised as a request. Not manipulation dressed up as concern. Just a genuine, open invitation that she was completely free to refuse. The Duchess looked at that extended hand. Strong, steady, absolutely certain. And she understood something profound. This wasn't just about a dance. This was about choosing to be visible. Choosing to exist publicly. Choosing to take the hand of one of the most powerful men in England and step onto that dance floor where everyone could see her. Where Cellini couldn't drag her back into shadows. Where she'd be undeniably present and real and human. It was terrifying. It was dangerous. It was potentially the stupidest decision she could make because it would infuriate her stepmother beyond measure and create consequences she couldn't even imagine yet. But standing there in her mother's blue dress, having already burned the bridges behind her, having already committed to this act of rebellion, the Duchess realized something. She was done making safe choices. Done hiding. Done disappearing. So she placed her hand in his, her fingers trembling slightly, but her grip firm, and let the Duke of Ashford lead her onto the dance floor. And as they took their first steps together, as the waltz swirled around them and every eye in that ballroom watched, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not freedom yet, exactly, but the first real breath after drowning, the first glimpse of light after years in darkness, the revelation that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone in this fight as she'd thought. And maybe, just possibly, her story wasn't over yet. He asked her to dance. Well, he'd already asked through that extended hand, hadn't he? But here's what made it different from every other gentleman who might have approached her that night. The Duke of Ashford didn't ask if she was accompanied. He knew she was. Didn't request Celine's permission, though protocol demanded it. Asking would have been an insult to him, and refusing would have been a public scandal her stepmother couldn't afford. He'd bypassed the entire system of control. Celine had built around the Duchess by making his invitation so public, so witnessed, that denying it would have caused exactly the kind of attention her stepmother desperately avoided. It was brilliant, really, strategic. And it gave the Duchess something she hadn't had in 2 years. A genuine choice. Not a choice between compliance and punishment. Not a choice between 2 different flavors of obedience. But a real, actual choice where no was just as acceptable as yes, and nobody would force her hand either way. She could have refused him. Could have curtsied politely and claimed fatigue. He would have accepted it gracefully, walked away, and that would have been that. But instead, she placed her trembling hand in his steady one and let him lead her onto that polished floor where everyone could see them, where she'd be undeniably visible, where there'd be no going back to shadows. The Duchess expected small talk, the kind of meaningless conversation that filled ballrooms across England every night. How are you enjoying the evening? The weather has been pleasant, hasn't it? Are you acquainted with the Worthingtons? You know, the polite nothings that let 2 strangers dance together without actually saying anything real. So when the Duke of Ashford spoke, his first words caught her completely off guard. You're either terrified or furious, he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears only as they moved through the first steps of the waltz. Your eyes are showing both. Which one's winning? Nobody had asked her how she actually felt in so long that she'd almost forgotten people could do that. Not, how are you, in that automatic way, where they don't really want an answer. but a genuine question about her actual internal state, asked by someone who was paying close enough attention to read the conflict in her expression. She stumbled, slightly, not from the dancing, but from the shock of being seen that clearly. The Duke's hand tightened at her waist, steadying her, and he waited. Just waited for her to find words. Didn't fill the silence with more questions or retreat into safer topics. That patience, that willingness to sit with her discomfort, was somehow more intimate than the dance itself. See, there's a difference in the way people look at you, and once you learn to recognize it, you can't unsee it. Some people look through you like you're glass, like you're just an obstacle between them and whatever they actually care about. The Duchess had gotten very familiar with that look. Servants glancing past her to see if Cellini needed anything, dinner guests making eye contact without really registering her presence, even her father sometimes looking at her face while clearly thinking about other matters entirely. Then there's the second kind of looking, where people observe you like you're an object. Pretty or useful or valuable, sure, but still a thing to be assessed and categorized. She'd seen that look too, in the few public events she'd attended. Men evaluating her marriage ability, women noting her dress or jewels or lack thereof, everyone calculating her social worth like she was currency to be counted. But the Duke of Ashford was doing neither of those things. He was looking at her, really at her, seeing her as a whole, complicated person with thoughts and feelings and agency. That third kind of looking, the kind that actually perceives the human being behind the face, was so rare that it almost hurt to be on the receiving end of it. Like muscles that haven't been used in years, suddenly being asked to work again. Painful, but necessary. Awakening, but uncomfortable. They'd been dancing for maybe a minute when he said something that changed everything. Not a question this time. A statement. Simple. Direct. Devastating in its accuracy. Your stepmother hates you. Not a guess. Not phrased politely as an inquiry. Just a flat observation delivered in that same quiet tone he'd used before, like he was commenting on the weather or the music. And the word hate hung there between them, forbidden and true, because that's exactly what it was, wasn't it? Not disapproval, not disappointment, not the complicated relationship between parent and child. Celine hated her, had hated her from the moment she married the Duke, and found herself saddled with a stepdaughter who reminded everyone of the first wife, the beloved wife. The woman Cellini could never measure up to, no matter how hard she tried. The Duchess felt something crack open in her chest at hearing it named so plainly. She'd spent 2 years making excuses, telling herself it was normal family conflict, believing that maybe if she tried harder to be good enough, Celine might eventually care for her. But the Duke had just taken a knife to all those comfortable lies and exposed the ugly truth underneath. Hate. Simple, pure, uncomplicated hate. And there was something almost liberating about hearing someone else say it out loud, because it meant she wasn't crazy. The monster was real. Someone else could see it too. You ever meet someone and feel like you've known them before? Not in a past life or any mystical nonsense like that, but a recognition. Like your soul already knows the steps to this particular dance, even though you've never done it before. The rhythm feels familiar, even when the music's new. That's what was happening between the Duchess and the Duke of Ashford as they waltzed through that glittering ballroom. It wasn't love at first sight. That's just chemistry, just bodies responding to attraction and possibility. This was something deeper and stranger, a sense that they'd been moving toward this moment through separate paths, that were always meant to converge. He understood things about her situation without her having to explain them. She understood the loneliness in his eyes, despite his power and position. They were speaking a language nobody else in that ballroom knew, having a conversation underneath the conversation, and it felt like coming home, to a place she'd never been before. The actual dance lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like it contained lifetimes of preparation, like everything that had happened to both of them had been leading to this exact waltz on this exact night. Destiny's too simple a word. Too romantic. This felt more like inevitability. Like watching puzzle pieces finally click into place after years of trying to force them where they didn't belong. With each step, each turn, each moment of his hand steady at her waist and her hand resting on his shoulder, the Duchess felt something shifting inside her. Those walls she'd built for protection, the ones that kept her numb and small and safe from further hurt, were starting to crack. Not because the Duke was tearing them down with force or charm or seduction, but because, for the first time in 2 years, she felt like maybe she didn't need them anymore, like maybe there was a person standing in front of her who wouldn't use her vulnerability as a weapon, who wouldn't twist her honesty into ammunition, who might actually be safe to let in past the barriers she'd erected between herself and the world. It was terrifying. Every instinct Selene had trained into her screamed to pull back, retreat, protect herself, remember that openness only led to pain. But there was another voice, quieter, but older, that sounded like her mother. Sometimes walls keep out the hurt. Sometimes they just keep out the help. And maybe, just maybe, this Duke wasn't someone she needed protection from. Maybe he was someone who could help her tear down the prison Selene had built, brick by invisible brick, until she was free again. The music swelled toward its conclusion, and the Duke leaned in slightly, his voice still pitched for her ears alone. "I'm going to do something highly improper now. I'm going to ask you to walk with me on the terrace. You can say no. You should probably say no, honestly. But I'm hoping you won't." And there it was again. A choice. A real one. She could feel Selena's eyes burning into her back from across the ballroom. Could sense the scandal this would cause, an unmarried woman walking alone, with a gentleman in the gardens. Could calculate all the ways this might ruin her already fragile reputation. But she could also feel something else. Possibility. The chance that maybe her story didn't end with Selene's victory. That maybe there was a different path, one she couldn't see yet but could sense just ahead, waiting for her to be brave enough to take it. The waltz ended. He stepped back, released her waist, but kept hold of her hand. Raised one eyebrow in that questioning way he had. Waited for her answer. And the Duchess, standing there in her mother's blue dress, with her heart pounding, and her stepmother's hatred radiating across the room, and her entire future hanging in the balance, realized she'd already made her decision the moment she'd defied Selene and come to this ball. She'd already chosen courage over safety. Might as well see where that path led, so she nodded. Just a small movement of her head, barely perceptible to anyone watching. But the Duke saw it, and something like satisfaction crossed his features. He tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow, formal and proper, and began walking her toward the terrace doors. And as they passed through the crowd, as they left the bright ballroom for the shadowy gardens beyond, the Duchess felt those cracks in her defensive walls spreading wider, felt light starting to seep in through the fissures, felt the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she was about to discover something she'd lost 2 years ago when Selene had begun her campaign of control and erasure. Not freedom yet, exactly. but the first real step toward it. The first genuine choice that was entirely hers. The first moment of being seen, really seen, by someone who didn't want to use that knowledge to hurt her. And whatever happened next, whatever consequences awaited her when she eventually had to face Selene again, this moment was hers. This choice was hers. This small act of rebellion disguised as a simple walk in the gardens was the beginning of something Selene couldn't control, couldn't manipulate, couldn't take away. And that revelation alone was worth whatever price she'd have to pay tomorrow. He led her to the terrace, and technically speaking, this was completely inappropriate. An unmarried young woman alone with a gentleman in the gardens at night? Society had very specific opinions about that sort of thing, none of them favorable. But here's the thing about propriety. Sometimes it's just another cage dressed up in prettier language. Appropriate behavior can be code for stay small, stay quiet, stay controllable. And the Duchess had spent 2 years being appropriate, being proper, being exactly what Selene demanded. Where had that gotten her? Invisible, erased, half dead inside. So when the Duke of Ashford held open those terrace doors and waited for her to step through, she didn't hesitate, didn't calculate the scandal, didn't worry about her reputation or what people might say or how Selene would weaponize this later. She just walked through those doors into the cool night air, and it felt like stepping from prison into freedom. The hardest part of telling the truth after years of silence isn't finding the right words. It's saying the first word. Because once you start, once you crack open that dam you've built to hold everything back, it all comes flooding out. The Duchess stood there on that terrace, the Duke beside her, and she tried to figure out where to begin. How do you summarize 2 years of systematic erasure? How do you explain the 1,000 tiny cuts that don't leave visible scars? The sounds of the ballroom faded behind them, music and laughter, and the buzz of 100 conversations becoming distant backdrop. And there, under stars that had witnessed countless human dramas but somehow made hers feel singular and important, she realized something. This was necessary. Not proper, not safe, not smart. Just absolutely, fundamentally necessary. How do you make someone understand that you've been drowning in a house full of people who thought you were fine? She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. And what came out wasn't eloquent or carefully crafted. It was just 3 words, simple and devastating. She hates me. And saying it, actually speaking it aloud to someone who was really listening, broke something inside her. Not broke like shattering. Broke like a dam finally giving way. 2 years of swallowed tears, suffocated screams, denied truths came pouring out. She told him everything. About the gaslighting through her father's imaginary illness, about the progressive isolation disguised as concern, about the lost opportunities and stolen jewelry and disappeared friends, about Mary hiding her dress and Selene's control and the slow, systematic disappearance of everything that made her herself. The Duke didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes or try to fix anything while she was still talking. He just stood there, leaning against the terrace railing, and listened. Really listened. The kind of listening that's active and engaged and present. And when she finally ran out of words, when the story had been told and the tears had been shed, and she stood there feeling raw and exposed and vulnerable in a way that was absolutely terrifying, he was quiet for a moment. Processing, maybe. Or just giving her space to breathe after that catharsis. Then he said something she didn't expect. Not, "That's terrible," or "I'm so sorry," or any of the sympathetic phrases people offer when they don't know what else to say. Instead, I know, and it ends today, said with such certainty, such absolute conviction, like he had the power to simply decide her suffering was over and make it so. And maybe he did. He was the Duke of Ashford. Men like him moved through the world with a kind of authority that could reshape circumstances, could open doors that had been locked, could protect people who'd been defenseless. But it was more than that. It was the way he said, I know, not I believe you or I understand, but I know. Like he'd seen the truth of her situation from the moment he laid eyes on her in that ballroom. Like all the secrets she'd been carrying weren't secrets to him at all. There's this thing about vulnerability that nobody really explains properly. Opening a wound for someone else to see is absolutely terrifying because you don't know what they'll do with that access. Will they help it heal, or will they pour salt in just to watch you suffer? The Duchess had learned, through painful experience with Celine, that showing weakness was dangerous, that admitting hurt gave people ammunition, that vulnerability was just another word for target. So she'd built walls, thick ones, impenetrable ones, walls that kept her safe, but also kept her isolated and alone and unable to connect with anyone real. But here's what she was learning on this terrace, with this Duke, under these stars. Some wounds only heal when they're exposed to air. Secrets are like infections, kept hidden in the dark. They fester and rot and poison everything around them. But brought into light, examined, acknowledged, they can finally begin to heal. The Duchess had been keeping her wounds hidden for so long, hiding the infection of Celine's abuse where nobody could see it, and it had been slowly killing her from the inside out. This telling, this exposure, this raw honesty, it hurt like hell. Hurt like cleaning out a wound that's gone septic. But it was necessary. The first step toward actually healing instead of just surviving. The Duke pushed off from the railing and turned to face her fully, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. I want to court you, he said. Not asked, stated. Then, as if realizing how that sounded, formally, publicly, with your father's permission and society's full knowledge. And before she could spiral into all the reasons that was impossible, all the ways Celine would sabotage it, all the obstacles between where she stood and anything resembling a normal courtship, he continued, not as charity, not as some rescue mission for a damsel in distress, but because when I looked across that ballroom tonight and saw you standing there, defiant and terrified and absolutely refusing to disappear, I saw something I haven't seen in any of the eligible young women who've been paraded in front of me for the past 5 years. He paused, and she realized she'd stopped breathing. I saw someone worth knowing, worth fighting for, worth standing beside. And there it was. Not a promise to save her, not an offer to sweep her away from her problems, but a proposal to be her ally, to stand with her in the battle, not fight it for her, to give her weapons and support, rather than just removing her from the field entirely. The Duchess felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the earlier ones. Not tears of pain or release, but something else. Recognition, maybe, or hope. I don't need rescue, she heard herself say, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. I need... She paused, searching for the right words. I need someone who will fight beside me. Not for me. With me. The Duke smiled, and it transformed his entire face from aristocratic handsomeness into something warm and genuine. That, he said, is exactly what I'm offering. And the Duchess understood something profound in that moment. She'd been framing her situation wrong this entire time. She'd been waiting for someone to save her, to solve the problem of Celine, to make everything better, while she remained passive and grateful. But that's not what she actually needed. What she needed was what he was offering: partnership. An ally who recognized her strength even when she'd forgotten she had any. Someone who saw her not as a victim to be pitied, but as a fighter who'd been forced to battle alone and just needed backup. That shift in perspective, from rescue to alliance, changed everything. They talked for another hour out there on that terrace, and the Duchess told him things she'd never spoken aloud to anyone. About her mother, and the woman she'd been raised to become. About the guilt of feeling like she'd failed that legacy by letting Celine control her. About the fear that maybe she was too broken now, too damaged, too far gone to ever be whole again. And the Duke listened to all of it. And when he spoke, his words carried a weight that came from his own experience with loss and loneliness, and the kind of isolation that comes from standing at the top of a hierarchy where nobody quite sees you as human. "You're not broken," he said quietly. "You're surviving. There's a difference. Broken things can't still fight, can't still choose courage, can't still show up to a ball wearing their mother's dress, knowing full well there'll be hell to pay for it. You did that. That's not broken. That's strong in ways most people never have to learn." And hearing that, having someone name her survival as strength rather than weakness, did something to those cracked walls around her heart. They didn't crumble entirely. That would take time. But they cracked a little wider, letting in a little more light, making space for the possibility that maybe she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. When they finally returned to the ballroom, late enough that eyebrows were definitely raised, that gossip was certainly brewing, that Celine's fury was probably nuclear, the Duchess felt different. Not fixed, not healed, not suddenly free from all her problems, but changed in some fundamental way, like she'd rediscovered a part of herself she'd thought was lost forever. The Duke escorted her back inside with all proper formality, but before they parted, he leaned in close, enough to whisper, "Tomorrow, I'll call on your father. Officially. Celine can't refuse me without insulting my house, and she's too calculating to do that. This is happening. You're not alone anymore." And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd with that natural authority that parted groups like water. The Duchess stood there, suddenly by herself again, in the middle of that glittering ballroom. But she didn't feel alone. She felt seen, known, understood. And maybe, just maybe, she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years: hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind of hope that comes from fantasy and denial, but real, solid, grounded hope based on actual possibility. The kind of hope that whispers, maybe there's a way through this after all. Maybe the story isn't over. Maybe revelation comes after the darkest silence. And maybe, just maybe, yours is about to begin. So here we are, at the end of this tale about a duchess who chose visibility over safety, courage over compliance, and found an ally when she stopped waiting to be saved. But here's the real question, the one that matters more than any fictional ballroom or aristocratic drama. What are you going to do with this knowledge? Because understanding how invisible prisons work is worthless if you don't apply it. If you just consume this story like entertainment and then scroll to the next thing without letting it change you. This Duchess's journey from silent victim to defiant survivor wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. It wasn't without cost. She didn't know if jumping off that cliff would save her or destroy her. She just knew that staying still meant certain death of everything that mattered. So let me ask you something. And I want you to be brutally honest with yourself. Where in your life are you accepting lukewarm water while the temperature rises? Who's controlling your narrative while you stay silent? What's the blue dress hanging in your closet? That symbol of who you could be, that you're too afraid to wear because someone told you it's inappropriate, too much, not allowed. Think about the people in your life right now. Are there relationships where you've stopped having opinions? Situations where you're always wrong and they're always right? Connections that leave you feeling smaller instead of stronger? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Recognizing the pattern is the first step, but it means nothing if you don't act. The Duchess could have stayed home that night, could have remained obedient, could have told herself that 2 more years of invisibility was safer than 1 night of defiance. And you know what? Part of her wanted to. The comfortable cage is still comfortable, even when it's killing you. But she made a choice, a terrifying, uncertain, potentially catastrophic choice to exist loudly instead of disappearing quietly. And that choice, that single decision to put on her mother's dress and walk into that forbidden ball, changed everything. Not because a duke showed up to save her, but because she saved herself first. She chose to be visible before anyone offered to see her. That's the secret they don't tell you about breaking free. You can't wait for perfect circumstances, or guaranteed outcomes, or someone else to make it safe. You just have to decide that you're worth fighting for, even when you're terrified, even when you might fail, even when everyone's telling you to stay small and quiet and controlled. So what's your Worthington ball? What's the thing you've been told you can't do, can't have, can't be? What's the voice in your head that sounds suspiciously like someone else, telling you that you're too naive, too impulsive, too much of whatever keeps you manageable? And here's the harder question. What would happen if you defied it? Not recklessly, the Duchess planned carefully with Mary, chose her moment strategically, understood the risks, but deliberately. What if you stopped asking permission to exist as your full self? What if you recognized that the people who benefit from your silence will never voluntarily give you a voice? What if you understood that waiting for the right time is just another form of the prison, because there's never a right time to choose freedom over safety? I'm not saying blow up your life without thinking. I'm saying think carefully, plan wisely, find your allies like the Duchess found Mary and the Duke. But then, act. Do the terrifying thing. Wear the blue dress. Walk into the forbidden space. Refuse to disappear just because someone finds your presence inconvenient. And let's talk about allies for a second, because this matters. The Duke didn't rescue the Duchess. He offered partnership. He saw her strength when she'd forgotten she had any, and he said, "I'll fight beside you." That's what you need to look for, not saviors who make you dependent, but allies who remind you of your own power. People who say, "I know," instead of, "I don't believe you." Who validate your reality instead of questioning your perception. Who stand with you instead of trying to fight for you. Those people exist, but here's the catch. You won't find them while you're invisible. You won't attract allies while you're hiding. The Duchess had to show up, had to be seen, had to risk everything before the Duke even noticed she existed. Your allies are out there too, but they can't help you if you're still locked in Celine's version of propriety and silence. Visibility comes before support. Courage comes before safety. That's the hard truth nobody wants to hear, but it's the only path that actually leads to freedom. Now, I want you to do something right now, not later, not when you're ready, but right now. Think of one small act of defiance, one tiny way you can choose visibility over invisibility today. Maybe it's stating an opinion you usually keep quiet. Maybe it's setting a boundary with someone who's used to you having none. Maybe it's literally just wearing something you love that someone told you was too much. It doesn't have to be dramatic. The Duchess's first act of rebellion was just deciding to go to a ball. Small step, huge consequences. Your small step matters too, because here's what happens when you start choosing yourself. It gets easier. Not easy, never easy, but easier. The first boundary is terrifying. The 10th is just Tuesday. The first time you say no feels like jumping off a cliff. The 100th time feels like common sense. You're building new muscles, new patterns, new neural pathways that remember what it feels like to exist on your own terms. And every single time you choose courage over comfort, you're proving to yourself that you can survive it, that you're stronger than the fear, that the invisible prison only has power as long as you believe you can't leave. Here's my challenge to you, and I'm serious about this. In the comments below, tell me one invisible prison you're recognizing in your own life. You don't have to use names. You don't have to give details. Just name the pattern. I recognize the gaslighting. I see the isolation. I understand the financial control. Because naming it is power. Saying it out loud, even to strangers on the internet, breaks the conspiracy of silence that keeps these prisons functioning. Celine's power depended on nobody seeing the truth. The moment the Duke named her hatred, the moment the Duchess spoke her reality aloud, the prison started crumbling. Your truth has that same power. So speak it, even if your hands are shaking, even if you're terrified, even if you don't know what comes next. Just name what you see, because that act of recognition is the first crack in the walls. And once you've named it, start planning your blue dress moment, your Worthington ball, your deliberate, strategic, terrifying act of choosing to exist visibly instead of disappearing quietly. You deserve that. You deserve to be seen. You deserve allies and partnership and freedom. But you have to choose it first. Nobody can give you permission to exist. You have to claim it. And listen, if this story resonated with you, if you see yourself in the Duchess's struggle, if you're starting to recognize the invisible prisons in your own life, or in the lives of people you love, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because we're going to keep exploring these patterns, these hidden conspiracies of control that exist throughout history and today. We're going to unpack the codes that keep people trapped, and more importantly, we're going to talk about how to break free. This isn't just entertainment. This is education for survival. This is pattern recognition that could literally save your life or someone else's. So don't just watch and forget. Engage. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Have the uncomfortable conversations. Start recognizing the lukewarm water before it boils you alive. And most importantly, choose your moment. Plan your defiance. Find your allies. And then, wear the damn blue dress. Walk into that forbidden space. Refuse to stay invisible just because it's easier for everyone else. Your story doesn't have to end with you disappearing. It can end with you dancing with your own version of the Duke, not as rescue, but as partnership, not as victim, but as survivor who decided she was worth fighting for. The revelation is yours to claim. The mystery of who you could be is yours to solve. So, what's it going to be? Will you stay in the lukewarm water? Or will you jump? The choice, as always, has been yours all along.